really pleased that we've got speakers from BEIS, from Energy UK, and from Citizens Advice, and from NEA to help us think through these issues. Before we start, I just wanted to, this has prompted so many thoughts, so many considerations about what's important in the short term, in the long term, and Peter Smith will do the considered view from NEA, but 5 things just keep shouting themselves kind of out to me. The first is that this is an opportunity to recognize, not just recognize because we've known this for a long time, but seriously embed it in the solutions to fuel poverty, that cold homes are an underlying medical condition. They are at the very least an underlying cause of medical conditions. And we need to understand what vulnerability, physical, health-related vulnerability means. And hopefully, if there's anything to come out of the response to COVID, it's that we finally get that proper articulation between public health, acute health, and fuel poverty mitigation. The second, and this is barely needs saying, that there's going to be an avalanche of accumulated debt across a number of households, negative household budgets. The scale of that, we don't know. People are kind of anticipating it and anticipating the response. But I think the character of the response is to accumulated household and personal debt, not to load points or meter points or necessarily to account numbers. It's the way in which people will experience it. The third thing that really runs across all this, underlying the importance of digital and data, 2 separate things. The contribution of smart prepaid to deal with some of the challenges of people on prepayment meters. How suppliers and government and agencies are able to proactively target support to people who need it rather than sitting back and waiting for people to present themselves. What the purpose and the value of things like priority service registers are, and it's been said for a number of years, but really underlined now, that broadband is an essential element, not only of being able to participate in markets and in society and civil society, but to enable people to access support and advice and help. And at the moment, we have people who previously have been either allergic or just unable to engage or to afford that level of connectivity, walking towards digital support in ways they haven't been for. And it's a challenge for lots of us to understand how we take advantage of that. Active and local coordination of support. I'm sure one of the things that Elizabeth will pick up on is that people who present themselves to suppliers and others are getting support. What about the people who aren't presenting themselves? What is the role of local coordinated community-based engagement to ensure that those people who really need it get the support they need? And the last one, and we're going to start with these, and the last one is the importance of the role of the state in addressing issues of huge inequality and challenge like this. I think, there's been a lot, and we'll hear more about it, about what the state will do, what governments will do, what they are able to do, what they do that other agencies and companies aren't able to do. So I think that's going to be incredibly important. We're going to have 10-minute slots from a range of presenters. We're going to start with Dave Newton, and I think it's Kirsten Horton from BEIS might be supporting Dave, and then we'll go through a range of different speakers. Put your questions through the chat. We'll gather them and we'll put them to people at the end. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get something from it. Please, if things occur to you that you aren't able to contribute or to intervene with, don't just go away thinking I haven't been able to make my point or get my answer. Please come back to us, because we want to use this obviously as a way of getting the broadest set of engagements and ideas and challenges that we can, not just to make the hour and a half go beautifully and swimmingly. So I think I'm going to hand over to Dave now and to take us through BEIS's position. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, firstly, thanks very much for offering us this platform to share with you some of the things we've been doing over the last few months, and really also to thank NEA as an organisation. We've really welcomed your engagement with us and the information you've been able to share with us on the developing picture of the impacts of COVID-19 on vulnerable consumers and the fuel poor. That's been a very welcome engagement and continuing our excellent relationship. Brian, I think you've got my slides there. Are you able to load them up onto the screen?
Yep, will do.
Thanks, Brian. Take centre stage, go on. Thanks, Brian. Thanks. Right, so I'm Dave Newton. Some of you might know me. I work in the energy retail markets team in Bays. I lead on consumer protection issues and consumer vulnerability. So the markets dimension of that's different to Panwin and Kirsten and co, who lead on the kind of fuel poverty side. So this is very much about, I very much work in the area of the kind of energy company interaction with customers and vulnerable customers in particular. Brian, can you knock on to the next slide very quickly? Yeah. So this is just a very quick reminder, as if you needed it, of just how rapidly the kind of picture on COVID-19 kind of developed in this country. So clearly, for a long while, we were seeing images from China and Italy and Spain and kind of noting what was happening. But, you know, if you think about the first 2 cases in the UK were recorded at the back end of January, and then how quickly that kind of led through the various, you know, the Chancellor announcing initial 30 billion of support in the budget in early March, and then within a week that was trumped by, you know, 10 times that amount in terms of loan guarantees and business. So you can just see how quickly the kind of picture developed, how quickly government and everyone has been really challenged to respond to the developing crisis that kind of emerged around COVID and eventually resulting in the lockdown announced on the 23rd of March. Now, Brian, if you can go to the next slide, please. I think it's really important to say that whilst we have within Bays Energy Retail a lot of experience of dealing with emergency type situations, so we were heavily involved in support for residents affected by the Grenfell Tower tragedy, obviously also involved with supporting residents impacted by things like the Somerset Levels flooding and various other flooding events over the last few years. The nature of this crisis, this situation, obviously trumps all of that in terms of its scale and its impact and its far-reaching impact across the whole of the UK and across the whole world, obviously. And so, whilst we do have a kind of repository of experience and knowledge about how to actually support customers in these situations, this was a unique challenge, you know, and we shouldn't underestimate just how much of a challenge this has been for everyone, including government. Now, in terms of our approach, very quickly, I think we certainly by middle of February and end of February, early March, we in the team, we really grasped the idea that this was not going to be some passing thing, that we were going to have to develop some options, some support for customers who may be impacted. And referring back to the previous slide, that thought was kind of contrary to some of the, you know, the kind of mood music around the country. So it wasn't really, as I say, until late March that really we saw a big response from government and others and the scientific community even around the need for, you know, quite extensive measures in the UK. But to be fair to the team, we really grasped the need to respond very quickly. And we discussed options with a range of stakeholders, including Citizens Advice, who were fantastic in terms of developing some overarching principles. And in particular, working with Energy UK, and thanks to Dan and his colleagues in particular for their help in really getting the agreement over the line. I shouldn't underestimate, and I don't want to underestimate, just how tricky getting an agreement with 60 odd suppliers, domestic energy suppliers, actually is in practice. I mean, there's the practical consideration of actually ringing round 60 odd companies, but clearly trying to get everyone to agree to a set of principles that are deliverable and meaningful for consumers is a real challenge. But thanks to everybody in the industry, from third sector stakeholders to Energy UK and Cornwall, we got it over the line. And I think hopefully I won't steal Dan's thunder in terms of what some of those kind of measures are, and I'm sure he'll go into some more detail, but we're really pleased with the level of response we've had from supply companies, and we can see from some of the metrics, which I'll go into later, that you know, there has been an excellent response from companies to this agreement. Brian, do you want to go to the next slide? Now, clearly, the support in the energy sector isn't in a bubble. There are a number of macroeconomic support schemes announced by government. And some of the numbers are quite dizzying in terms of the volume of support that's available. I think it's fair to say this is pretty unprecedented in modern times, at least. I don't think any of us could have really foreseen that, you know, Treasury would be announcing some of the support schemes it has done over the period of the coronavirus. I think in particular things like the furlough scheme, the various job retention schemes, and the business loan support schemes have been really, really well received, and actually in practice have delivered. I know there were some initial concerns around some of the delays in implementation, but, you know, obviously schemes of this nature can't be started overnight, and there's quite a number of considerations in actually setting these things up. But I think the right approach generally has been taken to supporting people in their jobs, and I think that's kind of one of the overarching messages in terms of government. So whilst we have a voluntary agreement in place in the energy sector, you know, for companies to support their customers, and that's either financially or for prepaid customers to stay on supply, and the specifics of the energy sector, I think the macroeconomic interventions have meant that we haven't necessarily had to make more sector-specific interventions in energy. So keeping people in jobs and keeping people keeping incomes at a high level as possible has, I think, yielded some benefits in terms of reducing the energy-specific impacts of the coronavirus. Brian, if you can go to. So I think what we have done, we've not been complacent about, that's a word I use a lot, around the actual efficacy of the voluntary agreement. Whilst the agreement's in place, we have been engaging with a wide range of stakeholders. We have citizens advice every couple of weeks. We speak to Ofgem weekly. We reach out to third sector stakeholders, including NEA, and we have regular calls with colleagues there to actually ensure that we are getting the constantly evolving and moving picture of the evidence of detriment, and to make sure that we're actually, you know, we're keeping on top of the emerging issues, because things are obviously changing as the furlough scheme moves into the summer, and we know that this is going to be tapered off towards the autumn. We recognise that this is not going to be something where there's a static picture, and that we might need to iterate and adapt our approaches to supporting customers as the summer and autumn continues. So we continue to engage with a wide range of stakeholders, in particular focusing on a few issues that may be close to some of your hearts. So I think we are very much seized of Adam's point around the picture on debt. So we recognise that a lot of the support so far has been around payment holidays and deferred payments, and preloaded top-up cards, which eventually obviously will need to be paid back at some stage. And so we are very conscious of the impact of that accumulation of debt in the energy sector, and we're working with colleagues right across all the regulated sectors. So we're doing some work with colleagues in the water and financial services and telecom sectors to think about how we can actually come up with a unified approach across regulated sectors, to ensure that there's no cliff edge. So when the various support schemes come to an end, how can we ensure that consumers are actually supported in that transition from the current support that's available into whatever the new normal might be? And clearly there's a lot of moving parts there, which make it quite difficult to say exactly what that might mean in practice. We don't know what shape the economy is going to be in come the autumn and winter. We obviously don't know what the medical outcomes are going to be in terms of the pattern of infection in the UK. Clearly things are on a downward trend at the moment, but we can't be complacent about the potential for a second wave, and we're very much doing planning with colleagues here around what that might mean in practice. So for example, if there was a second wave come the autumn and the winter, clearly there's potential for that to have a much bigger impact on the kind of vulnerable customers that you guys are actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And so we need to think really carefully about what additional support might be needed if there was a second wave at a time of the year when we're not having such fantastic weather as we're generally having at the moment, and people's ability to get out of their house and, you know, into the sunshine isn't going to be there, and you may have a whole bunch of people who are being asked to self-isolate and to stay in their homes during a colder part of the year. So that's something we're really focused on and thinking about and engaging with stakeholders in terms of some of the policy options. I mentioned data gathering there, the second bullet there. And that's a key point. So Ofgem very quickly initiated a weekly request for information. So that's a formal data gathering mechanism where they actually ask suppliers to provide, I think it's about 90 odd questions, responses to 90 odd questions on a weekly basis. And that's everything from staffing levels right through to the number of preloaded prepayment meter top-up cards that they're issuing, the amount of support that they're giving to their direct debit and credit meter customers in terms of deferred payments. And so it helps us to kind of build up a picture about demand on supplier services, and also, you know, what customers are actually asking their companies to help them with. So I think you'd be unsurprised to know that from that, I mean, it's confidential data, but I think in headline terms, we can say that it shows that there was clearly a big spike in demand around the end of March, beginning of April. So when the lockdown was initially announced, suppliers were being asked, you know, for support such as prepayment meter top-up cards, things like deferred payments of credit meter bills, and a range of support measures, basically. But it's fair to say since then, since that kind of end of March, early April period, that those requests have kind of tapered off quite a lot. I mean, they're not quite at pre-lockdown levels now, but they're not far off it. And I think we've been encouraged by the extent of the support that companies have actually been offering to their customers and meeting their customers' needs, but also by the transition, the slow kind of tapering off of those requests, which hopefully I think shows some signs that the macroeconomic measures of income support and universal credit, obviously, the additional payments there, and the furlough scheme may be helping customers to avoid the need to actually be asking for sector-specific support from their supplier. Now, clearly, we need to make sure we monitor that going forward. We've had discussions with DWP and HMT around any gaps that there might be in some of those schemes to make sure that we're covering all the bases there as well. Right, if you can go to the next slide. I've mentioned very briefly about some of the specific issues we're really concerned about. I think one of the biggest ones we initially have been concerned about and continue to be concerned is to make sure that prepayment meter customers stay on supply. Now, we know that prepayment meter self-disconnection is an issue, whatever the circumstances, and the risk that this will increase during the current coronavirus situation is increased exponentially, primarily because you have that kind of perfect storm where you have a bunch of people who are in lockdown, self-isolating, vulnerable people who may not physically even be able to get out to actually top up their cards. Then you've got the affordability side of it. So you've got a bunch of people who are either new to income shock or who have experienced over a prolonged period income shock, which is only made worse by this situation. And so we've done some work with Citizens Advice and other stakeholders, including NEA, to assess that situation, and we're keeping a really close eye on it. I know Ofgem aren't on the call today, but they have responded excellently, and you may be aware that they've launched a redress fund, COVID-specific redress fund of £10 million initially, aimed at preloaded top-up cards as vouchers, fuel vouchers, for prepayment meter customers who are suffering from affordability issues. And I know that they're looking to distribute those as soon as possible. And I think that's the first of a few phases of support that hopefully Ofgem can announce through the redress fund. We're looking at that and looking at the take-up of that in that area, and we'll keep everything under review as far as that's concerned. I've already mentioned the debt issue. So as I say, we're looking at cross-sector approaches to debt, but we're also looking at the debt profile in the energy sector. There's a huge risk of bad debt accumulating in the energy sector, and we need to make sure we've got the right policy responses to that. Ryan, can you go on to the next? I think I just want to finish off by saying that we've, I think, been really proactive in terms of actually seeking stakeholder support. We've made sure that we're really listening to what stakeholders are telling us, and that includes the energy supply business. I think we can't be blind to the impact of this on suppliers. So, for example, it's all very well government expecting suppliers to deliver support for their customers, but clearly these supply companies are businesses and need to stay in business to actually be there to support their customers. And so we've been really listening very hard to the supply sector, the energy supply sector, in terms of the economic impacts on their business. And we know that, you know, the impact of deferred payments on an already financially constrained sector are not insignificant. And so we just need to be mindful that we want to make sure there's a robust and healthy energy supply sector, but one that actually obviously supports its customers. So I think we've had to kind of try and balance those two things, making sure that supply businesses stay in business. And then when they stay in business, they're obviously doing the right thing by their consumers. I think it's been one of the good features about this current situation is that ministers have had an opportunity via various Teams meetings and various other things to speak to a much wider range of third sector stakeholders. And I've had the privilege of being on quite a number of those calls. I think we've got one with NEA next week, I think next Monday, I think with Minister Kwarteng. And I think the engagement of ministers with this agenda has been really, really strong. And they've been really keen to ensure that we explore every option with stakeholders. So today has been a really great opportunity to try and set out what we've done so far, our engagement process, the monitoring that we're doing to make sure that we're on top of things in terms of understanding the issue, and some of that longer term work we're doing to think about the autumn and the winter and considering what more might be needed then. But really what we want to do is make sure that everybody has the opportunity to feed into that and to give us whatever insights, lived experiences and information that they have to help us to shape our policy approaches and do the right thing by customers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. That was a great run through, which is why I kind of let it go on for a little bit longer. I think one of the things you mentioned there, which I think we've all got it in the back of our heads, is that wicked chickens coming home to roost, second wave, cold winter. Already we've seen the household costs increase, and preparedness to either maintain or extend the levels of support that are already being made available from government and from suppliers and network companies. So that beautifully leads us on to Dan Alchina from Energy UK, who has no slides but a most magnificent beard. And so over to you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Adam. And I'll probably use slightly less time as I knew this was going to happen, Dave, but you've covered quite a bit that I'd intended to say as well. So that's perfect. But yeah, what I'll try and do is give a bit of an industry view in terms of both where we've been over the last sort of 3-4 months and talk a little bit more about that future and what we see on the horizon. I think it's worth reflecting on the sector really had two immediate priorities during this time. The first has been ensuring we have safe, reliable sources of electricity and power, keeping the lights on. And the second has been, how do we support those people in the most vulnerable situations and those at risk of fuel poverty? And I think we've had to confront both of those priorities and challenges while at the same time dealing with what the rest of the world's been dealing with, and it is not necessarily always gone perfectly, but I think the sector can be quite proud of how it's responded. We've moved from having call centres on business parks on the edge of towns to call centres operating from people's living rooms. And that's, been a big step that I think the industry has taken and adapted to. And yes, it's taken time, but it is one that, that is improving and is working. In terms of the key support we put in place for customers, Dave talked about the voluntary agreement that was put in place with all suppliers. And Dave kind of alluded to the challenge there. He is completely right. Going out and getting a voluntary agreement from every supplier in the domestic market is a huge undertaking. And Dave at the team at Bays with a bit of support from us and Citizens Advice and others, but went out and got that done in a matter of days. And that was an excellent piece of work. Under that agreement, all domestic suppliers agreed to provide financial support for customers who were impacted by COVID-19. The nature of agreement like that meant that it was drafted so that they had flexibility, so that suppliers could choose how they provided that support and provide it in a way that best suited their operations and their customers. And while, I think some people would have perhaps liked to have seen greater sort of commonality in that support, I think in terms of moving quickly and getting some reassurances in place, the flexibility was the right approach, and it has achieved good results. Dave talked a little bit about the data, but I think at the peak that Dave was talking about, we were talking about suppliers extending up to 6 times more financial assistance on a weekly basis to pre-COVID levels to domestic customers. If we look at the non-domestic market, levels of financial support were up in the 23% sort of ranges, reflecting the challenges that businesses were having to shutter their operations. And I don't think the support has necessarily stopped at those principles. We at Energy UK have been hard at work ensuring that there is a supply of prepayment keys and cards, making sure that we have the infrastructure there to support customers and actually deliver support. And then we've also seen suppliers, volunteering staff that would have otherwise been out doing metering work to help deliver food and medicine. Suppliers sharing PPE that they're not using because they're not doing field activity with other frontline workers. So there's been a lot of good work there. Turning to the future a little bit, I think the one thing that sits quite prescient with me, and Adam and Dave already touched on it, is we're kind of still at the beginning of all of this. We spent 3 months responding to a lockdown and responding to the initial impact of the crisis. There's a much bigger, longer term set of challenges over the next 12, 18 months, who knows, ahead of us. We don't know how big the financial impact's going to be. And I think, what we do know, however, is that many people are going to find themselves in very difficult financial situations. And I think, interestingly, having spoken to members and looked at some of that data Dave's talking about, lots of people have found themselves in vulnerable circumstances and are at risk of fuel poverty overnight. Often people for the first time, people that we know, suppliers that we talk to that, generally don't have customer books that have necessarily large populations of people that have these sort of concerns, are reporting their customer books are beginning to look very different. And that's a whole new set of challenges for both suppliers and customers. And with that in mind, I think the announcement from the Money and Pension Service this morning of additional funding for debt advice is hugely welcome. And that's probably only the start of a much larger conversation about how that sector is funded that needs to happen. I think just reflecting on that though, and Dave kind of lent towards this at the end, I think I'm also left looking at it from the energy retailer's point of view, obviously that being our role. And I think there's two additional factors we need to take into consideration that also play into this longer term story. The energy system itself has cost a lot more money to run over the past 3 months. The cost of balancing the system, so very simple terms, the amount of electricity that comes onto the system needs to match at all times the amount that's coming off. Otherwise things tick off, and that has a cost. The cost of a lot of the renewable generation that is on the system have been exponentially higher than they would have otherwise been. We're talking hundreds of millions of pounds. And that is money that is eventually, like all things that are paid for by electricity suppliers, going to feed through to consumer bills. And that's something we need to be aware of down the line. And then equally, and Dave touched on this, I'll steal a phrase from my boss, she used it at the select committee last week. We're also doing this all at a time where for a number of factors over the last few years, the sector has been, pushed to driving efficiencies. And that's left us in a situation where the majority of companies in the sector, unfortunately, aren't profit making. The largest 6 suppliers made minus 2% last year. There isn't a huge wealth of cash down the back of the sofa, as Audrey said at the select committee last week. And that does mean that when we look to the future, the money that has been extended and lent to people in the short term to get them through the initial crisis will ultimately need to be repaid. And support cannot indefinitely keep increasing exponentially forever. And with that in mind, again, it very much reminds me of the financial crisis sort of, 10 years ago. There's going to be, we're going to need to look at the problem of how we support people through this and how we support the long-term impacts. And see what the role for everyone on this call is. If we're going to get through it, everyone has a role to play. Dave talked about the role of the furlough scheme earlier, and I think the furlough scheme has been an enormous success in terms of helping and supporting people. I think when I sat down, I was having conversations with Dave and his colleagues and people at Ofgem at the start of this crisis. We had a big concern about non-payment. And while non-payment issues have obviously emerged, the furlough scheme has been one of the key reasons why they have not been as big as we perhaps anticipated. It's been a great success. But that scheme will come to an end. It will get rolled back, and there is going to be a clear role for government to work out what support do individuals need and businesses need as we move past that. Equally, from an energy point of view, the experiences with this have really demonstrated, I think, to us, the benefits of smart metering, particularly as Adam said at the outset, prepaid smart metering in terms of how you're able to provide support to customers in a timely and quick manner. Therefore, I think there are some key lessons we need to learn about what does that mean for the rollout, and how do we get meters into those homes that need them, so that, you know, if there is a second wave, we are better prepared and better able to support people. A couple of longer term policy points I quickly wanted to mention. You know, looking longer term at support, and I know this will be close to Matt and Peter's hearts, but we also can't let the current situation stop the policy development that we need to happen from happening. We need urgent clarity from government on the future of warm home discount, which is currently due to end at the end of this year. Equally, we had some great manifesto commitments from this government in and around energy efficiency, you know, £7 billion worth of extra investment. We need to make sure that comes forward. You know, energy efficiency would seem to my mind, in our view, be even more sort of a no-brainer in terms of an area for focus. You know, you can improve people's homes, you can help them live warmer, more comfortable lives, you can reduce their bills, you can tackle you can tackle carbon emissions, you can also create jobs and get the economy moving again. It should be a win-win for everyone. And the final thing I just wanted to flag, and this is a bit of shameless self-promotion from us at Energy UK, but we're also going to be taking forward over the next couple of months the launching of a new voluntary code around customers in vulnerable circumstances. We're calling it the Vulnerability Commitment, is the name we've settled on. We're hoping we're going to be kickstarting that and actually opening it up to suppliers to come forward and sign up in the next month or two, with a launch later in the year. But we're hoping we're going to see lots of suppliers come forward, sign up, and commit to taking some really stretching commitments around how they support their vulnerable customers and how they provide them with an excellent service. And hopefully that means that, you know, and fingers crossed we don't, if we do see a second wave, suppliers are better prepared and better able to support their customers in need. And I'll probably leave it there if that's okay, Adam.
No, that's perfect. I think that was a very open and frank engagement with the issues. The thing that struck me, and it has done for some time, is how we pivot from this everything it takes, anything it takes we will do, which is the short-term response, to how we deal with this crisis as it unfolds, as the furlough scheme relaxes, as economic fragility hits many more kind of households, and what the structures of ongoing support will be. So thank you so much for that, Dan. And I'm always appreciative when suppliers or trade associations come to discussions like this and are open about their challenges as well as their necessary contributions to the problem. So now handing over to Peter and Matt from NEA I'm interested to learn what it is that we're saying about these things. So over to you, Peter.
Not sure if Peter's trying to speak, but he might be on mute.
He should be able to unmute himself there. I'll have a look for him, Matt. Just a second.
If not, Matt, can you take us through it?
Yeah, I'm happy to take us through it because we can't hear you, Peter. Still can't hear you, unfortunately.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's right. That's better.
Okay, apologies for that. Minor hiccup. Just wanted to say a big thank you for joining us. We've heard an awful lot today already about the work of central government, the energy industry, but I absolutely want to underline my thanks and NEA's thanks to all of you that are really at the front line in terms of helping vulnerable consumers get through this crisis and support them in the ways that that's been described, but also the other wider assistance that all your organisations play. Having quickly gone through the attendance list today, I think it's absolutely right to recognise the huge contribution that you're all making in your organisations, and I just hope that can continue. I'm going to quickly take you through, along with Matt, some of the things that we've been up to since the crisis struck. And also, I specifically want to talk about a report that we're launching today, or a briefing that we're launching today, called The Gathering Storm, which is specifically looking at the impact of utility debt and, importantly, what we can do about it. So next slide, please, Matt. So it'd be fair to say that at the beginning of the year, NEA as an organisation was looking forward to a huge amount of active policy development to help bear down on fuel poverty. We were looking forward to, as Dan mentioned, clarity about the warm home discount scheme, which ends at the end of this year. Looking forward to the government bringing forward a revised fuel poverty strategy with some very significant additional policies to match. It's true to say that the impact of the crisis has been a short-term hiatus around those policy areas, but we've been absolutely at the heart of trying to ensure that vulnerable consumers get the support that they absolutely need during the crisis. Matt, I think you're going to take us to the next slide.
Yeah, this slide just sort of shows the process we've gone through in order to collect insights and engage with some of the key stakeholders. So starting with collecting insights from our own staff, sharing them with Ofgem, BEIS, Energy UK and our members, so you guys, refining that through things like our COVID call for evidence, which we've just closed, to sort of test what we've seen and to gather new insights as well, and then resharing that with our stakeholders. And we aim to sort of continually refine that so we get the best overall picture of what's going on. And all of this will feed into the fuel poverty monitor, which will be released in September. And throughout this, we really do recognise that the need to provide access to energy as an essential service, and really welcomed the joint announcement from government and the industry that came previously, for all suppliers to sort of mirror what they're sort of meant to do in license agreements and other agreements, and the consumer vulnerability strategy from Ofgem in supporting vulnerable customers. So we're now working with suppliers to help the most vulnerable customers access the wider related support, and also, as I say, working with BEIS, Ofgem, Citizens Advice and Energy UK to share all of the insights that we've been able to capture. I'm just going to take you quickly through the changes that we've seen to the policy landscape. Don't look at the detail on this slide, because I imagine Dave will tell me it's wrong. But this is our sort of picture at the start of the year of what our year was going to look like, everything that was happening policy-wise. Sorry, and this is how we think it is at the moment. So that's what it was, and that's where it's going. So a lot of stuff has shifted into the future. There's been a lot of delay in things, and that has affected how how our priorities have developed. Peter's going to take you through how our priorities have changed, but also provide a snapshot of some emerging trends, especially with regards to our work on debt paper.
Thanks, Matt. So I think an important starting point for discussing this is about the recognition that COVID and the response to COVID in the industry, informing the industry's response to COVID, and hopefully the government's, is an important aspect of our work. Matt's already talked about the processes that have underlined that, but we know that despite the very welcome work that's going on, we've still got a huge job to do. And I'm not just talking from NEA, but as a community, the people that are on this call, we've still got a huge amount of work to do to raise awareness of the support that's available. We know that from our own engagement that there is a lack of understanding and detailed knowledge about what suppliers can provide. And we know that we've got to improve the accessibility of the support and the advice that's out there, so it's available in different languages, different ways of getting that message out there. We've also got to, as a community, work to address the challenges that we're seeing in terms of accessing that support, and hopeful that in the coming weeks in particular, we're going to see a real proactive step up in terms of suppliers contacting their customers to get in touch with people. We've also got to recognise that there is variance in support, and not everybody's going to have equal access to the very welcome commitments that have been made to support energy consumers. And where there are clear gaps in provision, we've got to acknowledge, quantify and address those. I'm talking particularly here about support for prepayment meters, but also and the related risk around self-disconnection, which we've heard recently Ofgem are likely to seek to address, but also importantly from the perspective of addressing consumer debt levels. As Dan rightly mentioned, we've also got to address the wider impact that the current crisis is having on policy making. So our immediate priorities have been shaped around the current crisis, but we are still doing the day job, and importantly, we're going to be continuing to press and engaging all of you to help make the case for us to get clarity on those very important policies that I've announced and those other areas that are flagged on this slide. Next slide, please, Matt. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, I just want to quickly take you through some of the content for the paper that we've published today, and I think the link for that is going to be circulated either during the slide, during this session, or straight afterwards. It'll certainly be available on our Twitter page later. Even before the crisis, we knew that fuel debt was having a huge impact with vulnerable customers or customers at large. Over 1.3 million electricity customers in debt, and 1 million gas customers repaying a debt to their energy supplier. It's important, as Dave rightly mentioned, that we don't just think about this in a silo. We don't just think about this as an energy issue, but we also look at the wider debt that people are repaying for other essential services like water, where indebtedness was perhaps even more ingrained than in the energy sector. We're trying to highlight that, as well as the huge impact that utility debt has in terms of people's health, wealth and well-being, and the impact it has on the viability of companies, it's also true to say that this will, unless addressed adequately, debt and debt levels will have a huge drag effect on the economy as we emerge from the crisis. So there's really three major considerations or motivating factors for us doing a lot more to try and tackle this in a much more coordinated way than just relying on business as usual schemes. Next slide, please, Matt. What we try and do in our paper is set out some immediate steps that can be taken to help address the situation. So I've mentioned one of them, and we know that there's already some good practice from a number of suppliers in relation to this. But all utility companies, not just energy suppliers, contacting their most indebted customers and making them aware of the support that's available, and the opportunity to have discussions about their debt circumstances and their circumstances around repayment plans, etc. Trying to make sure that we continue to provide suppliers, utility providers, with all the tools in the toolkit to enable that support to be proactive. So we make the case strongly for utility providers to be able to access the shielded patient list, to be able to directly target support and provide direct support to customers that need it, particularly around debt issues. And we highlight the opportunity to build on the great work that there's already been to raise awareness of the priority services register in the energy sector, and make sure that major anomalies I can never say that word, anomalies in relation to financial vulnerability are addressed by regulators, Ofgem and Ofwat, etc. We also think that there are tweaks that need to be made to the operations of companies, so customers are clear about how they can address billing issues in particular. And we welcome that we've already heard a commitment last week from Ofgem to get on and set out their final proposals for what we can do to address the risk of self-disconnection, and hopefully tied into that, make sure that we embed the ability to pay principles across not just energy but the wider utility sector. Next slide, please, Matt. Over the longer term, and I don't mean that long, I mean just not straight away, we need to see a response from government. Adam rightly referenced the absolute role of the state in helping to address these issues. Debt is a responsibility, debt levels is a responsibility that sits firmly in HMT's remit, and it's important that we act on that. So we welcome the announcements today that have been made around providing levels of support for debt advice. You'll see that that's one of the recommendations that we've made. So we're not doing too badly in terms of getting these action quickly. And we also think it's absolutely crucial that the government used breathing space legislation and bringing forward that framework to really create a package around what we can do to help address debt levels. Again, rightly mentioned the importance of providing clarity about what's going to happen on the Warm Home Discount Scheme, not only next year, but also in following years. It's right to address long-standing delays and friction in the application of benefits and make sure that the impact of the current crisis on people's incomes is recognised, and that temporary uplifts to benefits, for example, are sustained. The final thing I want to highlight is a genuine opportunity to reflect some good practice across different utility sectors. So in water, we have some very good practice at the moment about debt matching repayment schemes. And whilst Dan's absolutely right that that there are limitations to the support that suppliers can provide in isolation, if the UK government could put in some money alongside a customer's own debt repayment plan, that would help clear debt a lot quicker. And so we're looking at various models around that. And we've got a call next week, as Dave mentioned, with the Minister to try and bring some of that to the fore. Can I have the final slide, please? Actually, two final slides. Bear with me, Adam. The final two slides, I just wanted to talk you through what's happening in the future, in the near future. Obviously, we're going to continue to engage around the direct impact of COVID and try to address those for customers and make sure that there's consistent treatment for customers. But we're also going to be getting more vocal about our campaigns, underlying, as Adam mentioned right at the beginning, the huge overlap between the health links of living in a cold home and the health impacts of COVID and what we can do about them, importantly. We're going to be influencing the upcoming stimulus package that's going to be revealed in July, we understand, and making sure that energy efficiency, in particular the government's manifesto commitments, sit at the heart of that. We're going to be continuing to push on our work to get the issue of utility debt adequately addressed across different sectors, and pushing on our work around the Warm Homes campaign. Matt, did you want to quickly come in on these consultation responses, take people through what we're going to be doing on that in the short term?
Yeah. So, lost it. So we will be. So we are doing consultation responses on the BEIS consultation on the future of low carbon heat. So what's happening after the renewable heat incentive to provide a financial incentive to households to take up things like heat pumps and how that can benefit fuel poor households. The Environmental Audit Committee in Parliament is doing an inquiry on energy efficiency, which we'll be submitting evidence to. The Labour Party is consulting on what a green recovery should look like, and we'll be submitting evidence into that to try and shape what the opposition says about a green recovery whilst the government is looking at it. And also, as Peter mentioned previously, Ofgem have said they're going to consult on measures to help with those who self-disconnect regularly, and we'll be feeding into that and trying to make sure that gets implemented as quickly as possible.
Okay, well, for the sake of time, I think we have one more slide, which is just going to draw things to a conclusion. But for the sake of time, I'm going to leave it there, and looking forward to the discussion and questions later. There's a huge amount to get through in terms of our response, but also the breadth of what we're doing at the moment. But I hope some of that can come out in the questions later. Thanks very much for your time.
Oh, thanks, Peter and Matt, for that. I mean, one thing just to add, I think most of the people, participants, are members of NEA, and we're delighted that so many are there. The opportunity and the fundamental necessity to engage with BEIS and with Ofgem and with Welsh Government and with everybody else about the steps that are needed to have not just a necessary but a sufficient response to this. It's overwhelming. So we really ask you either here or after the event just to enable us to draw upon your experience and insight so that we can have the strongest and most robust challenge and constructive engagement with governments, regulators, suppliers, network companies, to ensure that we get the strongest package of support. So please do keep kind of feeding that stuff into us to make our advocacy even stronger. One more speaker and then we'll come to the question. So please use the chat function. For those of you who know where it is, toggle your whatever your device is, your mouse, and there's the chat function, and you can suggest questions that Matt will then pick up and we'll be able to put to the speaker. So I'm delighted for the last speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Blakelock from Citizens Advice. I was once of that parish myself, so absolutely delighted. Fundamental role, absolutely fundamental role. Not only as the statutory consumer watchdog pulling the advocacy there, but as the repository and actually the prophetic voice of so much of the experience that vulnerable consumers are going through. So Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you. That's a very kind introduction. I wonder if you might follow me around my professional life and reiterate that. Thank you. I'm going to just launch my slides, and while I do that, I'd like to invite you to have a think about what this crisis might have looked like if we already had delivered some of the policies that we all worked so hard on last year. Can you imagine what this crisis would have been like if there was a foundation expected of every market entrant into the retail market of being able to interact with vulnerable consumers for every energy supplier? And if the majority of energy suppliers were already at the level that we delivered by the Energy UK vulnerability commitment. Apologies, I had to check my notes there because I haven't quite learnt where they settled on the wording. So I'm just going to launch my slides while you have a think about that, or attempt to do so. Apologies.
We only agreed it last week, Elizabeth, don't worry.
Oh, I'll get there eventually. Here we go. So what I'm attempting to share at the moment, although I can see that the pictures aren't displaying, which slightly undermines the use of slides, I'll see if it catches up with me. It's a snapshot of the data that we've been seeing through the crisis. What I'm going to share with you today in terms of data is based on telephone advice, but as we do our wrap-up reporting from this initial period, we're also drawing extensively on the experiences which are captured by our local citizens advice offices, which bring to life really not only the energy requirements and the real challenges for energy consumers, but how those challenges in affordability interact across multiple different sectors and the challenges that people have faced through this period, which I expect to continue into the future. So quickly, the themes that we've been seeing for those of you who are maybe less familiar with our work on the telephone, in addition to our extensive networks of offices who have pulled up the most amazing pivot into delivering advice on phone and also through web chat. And we also have the national consumer line. Apologies, I hope you can still see me. I can't see you for a moment there. To support in giving energy advice over the telephone with an escalation route to the extra help unit. And from the discussion that we've had already today, you won't be surprised to see, if you can see, here we go, the vast majority of concerns that we've seen being escalated are into the extra help unit are related to the inability to credit a prepayment meter. So self-disconnection, not a term I am a fan of in terms of it being a choice. What we see really is that it's often not a choice not to put funds onto your prepayment meter, it's simply a necessity. Unfortunately, we're also seeing cases being escalated to the extra help unit where there's not a suitable payment scheme in place, and that's a mixture of people who've already had a payment scheme for an energy debt in place and the changes in their circumstances mean that's no longer suitable, but also people who have not recently been in debt and unable to reach their supplier to negotiate and associate, an effective or suitable for them payment scheme. So from the consumer service overall, this is an overview of a single week's cases, but it's quite typical at the moment. What you can see there is some concerns around the affordability of energy, and also many cases which have come through. I'm so sorry that my Wi-Fi keeps flickering and you keep losing slides there. The metering cases are really interesting. There's a real mix of different root factors, but the core thing here is that the metering jobs are being really focused on emergency cases. Absolutely the right thing in this crisis area, but it's causing a lot of delays and challenges for consumers, whether it's concerns about the whether or not it's an accurate meter reading, people who are relying on quarterly reads who are on the priority service register, but also some standard metering jobs like reconnections that are just not going ahead. And even when the person is in a vulnerable circumstance, what we're finding is that because they are simply metering jobs that have been put in a bucket which says not urgent, even though that one scenario is urgent, it's just that much more difficult for the consumer to be able to get that job sorted. And we are still seeing off supply cases, mostly to do with people who aren't able to credit their prepayment meter, and people who aren't able to access the shop even to top up their prepayment meter, even though the lockdown rules have been softened. And really importantly, I think for the energy work more than other debts, is people who just simply can't reach their supplier. Now, this has certainly improved after an enormous peak at the beginning of the crisis, but we are hearing from industry that they do really expect people to be able to get through, and they're confident that their customer service operations are back to a normal level. Unfortunately, that's not been our experience even into this week. And what we're finding is that people are still giving up on reaching their supplier in queues, but also, and this is really important for the future, IVR messages and auto response emails, which are discouraging people from contacting even if they do have a serious issue around affordability. So people are seeing the messages about, we are only, as an energy supplier, we're only coping with emergency cases right now, and they are taking themselves out of that bucket because the meter's not on fire, or they're not yet out of supply because they've got £1 left on their prepayment meter, and they are not considering themselves as an urgent case until they do go off supply. We've also seen some use of the 105 number to get through to a network, which is people who are opting into that kind of emergency category. And I think what that shows me really clearly is that we need to be very careful when we're talking about the future, about the supplier being the front line for a lot of support, because we know from decades of research that the awareness of support from energy suppliers can be very low, that trust is very low in energy suppliers, so that the idea that you could have a single sector support scheme that can help people and that alone is going to be able to carry us through the next year is simply doesn't match with the data. And I know many of you have seen the same reports as I have that show that what you need is a consistent and coherent message. And unfortunately, the range of experiences from different energy suppliers and different places in their journey on interacting with consumers in vulnerable circumstances has meant that we haven't had the quick and coherent turnaround across the industry that we've seen from some energy suppliers who did already have the expertise in-house to interact with consumers in vulnerable circumstances. I'm going to give up on my slides now to pull out two themes, if I can even get the screen up to stop sharing. So firstly, something that's been really consistent across the board is the really significant impact on people who are digitally excluded, and that causes me a lot of concerns for the future. We simply cannot say that because one can upload a meter read that we can assume that people will do so in the future, or that a brilliant app can mean that you can interact with your energy supplier to ensure that you have an affordable repayment plan. Not only digitally excluded, but also the fact that this has really shone a light on the people who have in the past been able to rely on their social network to be able to access apps and manage their account online. So we've had plenty of cases from people who are relying on family members who speak English, family members such as grandchildren who are able to use an app and help with the app, not able to do so because of social isolation. Now, as someone who taught their 92-year-old grandfather to use Zoom through the window socially distanced. I can tell you this is not a sustainable way to make sure that people have access to the support they need. And as we accelerate changes in the energy industry to meet the really important net zero world, we're going to need to make sure that we're not relying on an effective broadband connection and confidence in using different apps to talk to your energy supplier, particularly when we've seen an explosion in scams to take advantage of people who are not used to or not have not had the chance to learn to avoid those situations where payment information can go astray in so many different ways. Final point from me before we move on, so that we have plenty of time for discussion. I just don't think I can close my section without highlighting the long-term impact that I would expect that energy debt would have on households. We know that energy debts can take years to clear. And whilst the BEIS principles have had a brilliant impact for so many people who have reached their supplier to make sure they can stay on supply, whether it's issuing of fuel vouchers, extending repayments, pausing repayments on debt, it's simply moved a it simply delayed this huge peak in debt that is not only for energy. So any next steps will need to have a consideration for the fact that people's bills will be coming in across the board from across the sectors. So what we're going to need to do is make sure that all of the networks we've all built up, and I can see lots of familiar faces that cross outside of energy, are really operationalized in this crisis period to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where you've got 10 different forms to fill in to apply for 10 different sector assistance schemes. Those assistance schemes might be in place, but it's completely unreasonable to expect people to have an ability to pay compensation with 6 or 7 different organisations and firms. And what is needed instead is an acceptance that we're going to need a cross-sector view of repayment of debt, but also time for people to be able to respond to their very different financial situation. Absolutely in terms of payment holidays, but also in accessing the debt advice. It's great to see that the funding is coming through, but the fact is that debt advice charities across the board, large and small, are under an enormous amount of pressure already. And all sectors are going to need to give people time to access that advice, to organise their finances, to then be able to have a very effective conversation with their various utility providers. I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you so much, Elizabeth. That's brilliant. So lots of stuff in that, and the one that always strikes me in these situations is if one of the criticisms of the global response to COVID-19 is that it's been done primarily on a national basis and therefore failed to identify all the opportunities and synergies that were there, changing now. Similarly, if we do this as a sectoral kind of basis, when the challenge is accumulated debt and constrained household incomes across a range of supplier, we would have failed almost at the first hurdle. So all the positive stuff that's happening in the sector needs to be part of a more holistic package that's focused on households that are struggling to get through, to cope with, find a way forward through these challenges. So brilliant, we've got a bit of time for questions. I am going to rely on Matt, my colleague Matt, to come in with a couple of questions, but some of the ones that have been scrolling through the chat kind of function seem to be particularly appropriate. And I know that Dave, your responsibility in BEIS isn't for the big energy efficiency or fuel poverty programs, but there's a couple of ones that match together, and I would hope that Peter and others will jump in as well. I mean, the first is, we've had this allergic reaction, if we're honest, in Whitehall, not to seek lessons from elsewhere in the UK, whether it's the Welsh Nest kind of scheme or whether it's Scottish government schemes, and also a difficulty to understand what the role of local governments, cities, metros, unitary councils would be. I suppose there's one open question, is about, are we, for BEIS, are we learning the lessons from the different national responses and the different national programs that are there? And I might put the finger on Peter to respond to this one. Is this another opportunity that we're going to miss about understanding what the real value of locally based, especially local authority-led responses to this complex of issues may be? Dave, are you able to shed any light on learning actively from Nest?
Adam, I'm here as well, so I'm happy to jump in. Yeah. So I work with Dave in BEIS, but I work on fuel poverty strategy and work more on the energy efficiency side. And I've seen a few questions about energy efficiency programs going forward, about working with the other nations of the UK, about working with local authorities. So I can try to address a bit of that while keeping it brief. Certainly, as a couple of people have mentioned already, in the Conservative Manifesto, there were plans for some energy efficiency schemes, and we are still very committed to bringing in energy efficiency. It is a very good and sustainable long-term way of bringing down energy bills. And so for the long run, that definitely needs to be our approach. But obviously, at the same time, we need to make sure that we take those decisions really thoughtfully and make sure that ministers can give adequate time to thinking through all the aspects of that. So we're looking for kind of future financial decisions later this year to get the final word on those. In terms of working with the other nations of the UK, we have very regular meetings. We meet with them quarterly, if not more often, to discuss the different schemes and discuss what's working, what's going well, what's not working as well. So we are very interested in talking to Wales, and we do regularly talk to Wales about how Nest is going. And as we've said, we're looking at what future energy efficiency schemes we can do. We've talked to Northern Ireland about our private rented sector regulations and what they might be interested in doing. So we do have a productive relationship with the other nations. And I think as well with local authorities, there's quite a few different areas that we work with local authorities on, whether that's working alongside Warm Home Discount, as some people were saying in the chat, working on making sure that housing is safe and adequate, especially private rented sector. Yeah, so there's quite a few areas. I'm sure we could talk for quite a lot longer and have a very interesting conversation about that, but I hope that's a good starting point.
Just to quickly come in, I think it's a huge opportunity now to do just that. I'd have hoped that the hard lessons have been learned about the need to support existing schemes that are run by suppliers through supplier obligations with a national scheme is well understood. You know, it was underlined in bold letters by various committees last year, and one presumes when the Environmental Audit Committee do their report this year, they'll find exactly the same thing. And there's a huge consensus around that. And I find it very reassuring to check in with colleagues from Wales and Scotland to make sure, you know, we push back on the assumption that energy efficiency is very difficult to deliver. It isn't very difficult to deliver. We've got some very successful models that are in operation not too far away. So yeah, I think it's important to do that. I think the big challenge will be finding the cash. So I think it's absolutely the case that there is constrained public finances. As a direct result of the crisis and the support that's been made available to deal with the crisis. But we have got to look at things that are make a good return for the Treasury and good for the economy and need to be invested in on that basis, but also earmark, and not directly in terms of hypothecation, but earmark some of the huge significant revenue streams that are coming into the Treasury, particularly next year when we establish the ETS. It's going to bring in something to 4 billion to 10 billion pounds worth of revenue to the UK government, straining the already stretched resources that people have in their own pockets, consumers have in their own pockets. So we've got to look at some of those resources and say it's fair enough to invest some of that cash or equivalents to make sure that we're keeping people warmer in their homes.
Thanks, Peter. I'm just looking around to see if any of the presenters want to come in on kind of any of that, because if not, I'll go to another thing that's being going through the chat, which obviously we've got a lot of organisations on this call that deliver direct service and support to vulnerable households, and have been able and will do through the EST redress kind of fund to target even more support, often through top-ups for people on prepayment meters. But there's a couple of comments already which has been about, well, the people who are coming forward, yes, they can benefit from a top-up, but there's a history, there's a backstory of debt and arrears that means not only they may have been through them before and they may not be eligible for the new set, but it's not even close to being a sufficient way of addressing the needs of these householders, and that we need schemes that are much kind of broader in delivery, longer term debt and budget kind of planning, much more money advice. I wonder, Dan, whether you're seeing within the vulnerability commitment and the vulnerable commission that you did before, this understanding about the role that suppliers may play, but generally the need for the most vulnerable and constrained customers to have access to a much deeper sense of financial kind of support.
Yeah, if I reflect on the Vulnerability Commission that we provided the Secretariat for, that was led by Lord Whitty, that concluded its work last year, that was sort of a theme that ran behind everything that we everything that the Commission sort of looked at and looked at, fundamental issue was a lack of money in people's pockets. And I think, Peter mentioned, and I think others mentioned the work Ofgem have got around self-disconnection and the ability to pay principles. And I think that's all really good work, and fully support Ofgem bringing it forwards and getting that work done and in license. But again, what those rules look to do is they deal with the consequences. They deal with helping people as they experience difficulties. What they don't do, because it's outside of Ofgem's remit, is, well, how do you prevent people getting into those situations to begin with? And the fundamental challenge we have is a lack of money, which we're only going to see exacerbated by this crisis and the steps I guess a lot of people have had to take to get through the last 3 months.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Other things that have been popping up, and I'm trying to see if I can scan the chats at the same time, but unfortunately I can't. Two other things that have jumped up, certainly been mentioned a couple of times. One is around, and Peter, maybe you can deal with this when you kind of sum up about how people get involved in activity to ensure that some of those understandably delayed policy decisions around hugs, around eco next stage, around warm home discount, how we can ensure that there's sufficient focus and drive behind getting those in place. For those of us that are particularly involved in the delivery of warm home discount industry initiative schemes, there's a lead-in. there's the need for suppliers to get their head around what their obligations are before they commit to schemes. So there was that, and there was one other that came up, which was, for all the power and the value of the agreement with supplier, what about those in deep rural communities surviving on oil or solid fuels? What are the mechanisms for those off-gas communities, whether through the regulatory frame for DNOs and GDNs, or whether support directly to the households that we need if this is going to be a sufficient response to all households who may be at risk, at greater jeopardy because of fuel poverty in the COVID situation, rather than just those who are at risk and in jeopardy, but who have an existing relationship with their energy supplier. I have no particular victim in the presenters for that, so I'm just going to throw it open and hope that someone's going to be bold enough to jump in and provide an answer.
So I'm going to start by saying that in my academic life, I would say that this exclusion, this leaving behind of people who just aren't covered by Ofgem regulation, is a trick of history, and it's one that we can absolutely overcome as we look to make sure that Ofgem, or the energy regulation, is regulation for energy services. We're going to need to do that as we start to use such a diverse range of ways of heating and lighting people's home in the future. So as we do that, we can't just be thinking about the swizzy new innovations and the new technology. This is a chance to look again at those groups of people who are not, the price of their energy is not scrutinised, whether that's people in park homes, whether that's people who are off the gas grid. These are exclusions we can overturn with the policies that are being implemented now. And the way that groups have been excluded has been systematically shown, and I would definitely like to plug our Fair for Future report of citizens' advice that lists all of those groups of people who have been excluded by the considerations of what the future market and the future energy system should look like.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I know that it's been a big focus of BEIS about making sure we, and the whole of government, identify those people who are most likely to fall through the gaps of the emergency provision, and we should make sure that we include in that number those folk who've been falling through these gaps for quite some time because they're regulatory or market provision or just straight market failure gaps as well. I'm going to turn now to Peter to give a quick policy summation from NEA, and then I'll say goodbye from all of us. Peter, over to you for your last thoughts.
Thanks very much, Adam. Just picking up the last point very briefly, I think it's really important. We support the case for greater regulation for off-gas fuels, and we've recently responded to the district heating consultation, and we desperately want to see a bit of a rethink about the policy option that's being considered there to make sure that the district heating customers have as significant protections as electricity and gas customers, and we think that there's a tweak that needs to be made to the preferred policy option to do that. I just want to start off by thanking all of the participants. We've had a diverse set of views, but a huge amount of consensus coming through about the need to address key issues. I think it was very useful to have the wider scene set by Dave Newton about the government's wider response to this, as well as the establishment working alongside industry of the agreement to support customers, particularly vulnerable customers. We've heard quite a lot about that agreement. We touched on some of the challenges in terms of customers being aware of that support and accessing that support. And it's important that we all as a community, people that are on this call, continue to drive up awareness of that support, and we start putting out consistent messages in different formats to make people aware of it. And the supplier community also do what they can to be proactive about getting in touch with people to offer that support. I think that there's a very, very broad consensus as well in terms of the outstanding issues in relation to consumer debt, and the need to tackle that in a systematic and coordinated way across utilities, not just within the energy sector. That doesn't mean that the energy sector can sit on its hands or should sit on its hands. There's a lot that it can do in the short term to either continue to get the word out about existing support or consider other actions that are helpful just within the energy sector. But looking to the government's response in relation to this issue, we know that it should be cross-sector, and I hope our report today, The Gathering Storm, will offer some insight in relation to that. Overall, I think that there's a sense that we've, whilst no one would describe what the country and people suffering from COVID have experienced in the last few months as a dummy run, we have had a very acutely painful dry rehearsal for what things could be like going into a cold winter, suffering with high levels of mortality and morbidity associated with people that can't heat their homes, possibly alongside an influenza outbreak. And so that should motivate us above anything else to really dig these issues out, pick them up and push them across the line where we do need to see some progress. And I think that sense of momentum is really, really important. And if we lose track of that and we don't keep our handle on the things that we can do, particularly in the short term, then we are setting ourselves up for a big issue coming into the autumn and the winter. And the final thing that's come out for me, although that there's lots that we could pick up, is the sense of importance and drive for us to get back onto the business as usual issues which are so crucial to customers as well. So we've heard about the Warm Home Discount Scheme, we've heard about manifesto commitments, we've heard about a whole range of other things that are still pending while we deal with this crisis. And it's important that we all look to make compelling arguments that don't just set these things off in silos and say, well, you have the business as usual things that you've got to get on with as well. There are clear links between our agenda and the wider tackling of COVID, and we need to make those explicit and use that as a motivating factor for policymakers in the coming months. Just in terms of finally want to finish on how everybody can get involved. First of all, thank you for already being involved. You're involved by being on this video call. You're involved by having signed up to our joint letter calling for the urgent extension and expansion of Warm Home Discount Scheme. So you're already making a difference and supporting our advocacy there. And thank you for that. We will provide in the coming weeks, particularly as we build up to this announcement at the beginning of July about a recovery package, some quick and easy ways for you to help strengthen our advocacy and also underline your own arguments as to why crucial support for fuel poor households is absolutely going to need to be at the heart of those announcements. So more pending. This isn't happening in isolation, this event. There's going to be more to come, as I think Adam's going to touch on. But I found it incredibly useful getting that shared perspective from a range of participants and also some of the questions and thoughts that have come through on the feeds. Thank you very much for it.
Thanks very much. Yes, Peter's absolutely right. I mean, this is one of the digital events we're looking to run, and actually, mainly we have members and supporters here. The next things that we'll be doing is to roll out the online regional fuel poverty forums, because we're aware that we need to engage and capture with people in localities where we get that sense of synergy in local groups. But you know, this year I'm the poor sap who's overseeing the first year when NEA is not going to have an annual conference for a number of years. That's not a great achievement, and we need to fill that space productively. So we'd be really interested in ideas about what we should be doing these sorts of opportunities on. That would be incredibly welcome. There's lots of, you can't sum this up because it's not finished yet, because we don't know what the emerging crises will be, what the next kind of flavour of it will be. There's a few things. It's quite a distasteful comment, but it's one that's always true, and it's Churchill's about don't waste a crisis. What we are doing is we're crystallising things that we've known for a long time. We know the causes of fuel poverty, we know the incidence of fuel poverty, and we know the solutions to fuel poverty. But it does often take real crises to focus people's minds on those as being higher up the hierarchy of priorities than they may have been in, they don't feel like it, in more benign times. So we have to take the opportunity that's presented to us to match all those combining issues together. That's really important. We need additionality, not diversion. You know, we need to make sure that what we bring forward is new and contributes to a greater and deeper level of support for the people who need it more, rather than just saying more things have floated into our peripheral vision, so we need to divert that level of support elsewhere. We definitely need to do that. And of course, we need to do it all in the frame of a economic recovery which is healthy in terms of the medical impact of fuel poverty, which is green in terms of reaching up towards the decarbonisation of heat and net zero, and makes sense locally, because what we know is that you need those local actors to make sense of what's needed in particular locations. So there's an awful lot to be done. Please do give us your thoughts about what more conversations we should be having, not just over the next kind of few months, but throughout the course of this crisis. So look, it's I've got minutes. I've got 2 minutes left. Thank you so much to the speakers who came on and were prepared to be open and honest. Thank you so much to everyone who's participated. We've still got 79 people on the call. We had 83 at the beginning, and believe you me, I dropped off so many of these calls over the past few weeks. That's a miraculous display of stamina and commitment and testament to the quality of the presenters. So thank you so much. We want to do more of these, but we want to do them not from what NEA want to say, but we want to do them in such a way that match onto your experience, your insight, and what you need us to be, what you need these conversations to be about. Thank you to everybody. Thanks to the speakers, and hopefully we'll see you very soon on a digital platform near you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.